Hi there, boys and girls. Tonight for story time, we're going to read Mr. Forgetful by Roger Hargreaves. It was one of those beautiful summer mornings that everybody likes. The owner of Forget-Me-Not Cottage was fast asleep and dreaming. His name, of course, was Mr. Forgetful. The sun was streaming into the window and woke him up. He yawned and stretched his arms. He tried to remember what he'd been dreaming, but of course he couldn't. You see, Mr. Forgetful couldn't remember anything. Anything at all. Ever. Mr. Forgetful got out of bed and went to wash his face, but he'd forgotten where his bathroom was, and he walked into the closet instead. Silly me, he giggled to himself. Eventually, of course, Mr. Forgetful found his bathroom, and he washed his face, and even remembered to brush his teeth. Finally. Always brush your teeth in the morning. 2 times a day, in the morning and at night. Then Mr. Forgetful went downstairs to make himself some breakfast. He toasted some bread, but he forgot about it, and it burned. He boiled himself an egg, but he forgot about it, and it turned hard-boiled. In fact, Mr. Forgetful burned his toast and hard-boiled his egg every morning. It was such a lovely day that Mr. Forgetful decided to walk down to the village. He needed to buy a stamp for a letter that he had written 3 weeks ago, but he had forgotten to mail it. Did he remember to shut the door of Forget-Me-Not Cottage on his way out? Of course not. He's Mr. Forgetful. Good morning, Mr. Forgetful, said Mrs. Parcel in the post office. What can I do for you today? I'd like oh dear, I've forgotten. A stamp? Suggested Mrs. Parcel, looking at the letter Mr. Forgetful was carrying. Yes, a stamp. That's what I was trying to remember. Trying not to forget, said Mr. Forgetful. As Mr. Forgetful left the post office, Mrs. Parcel smiled. She was used to Mr. Forgetful forgetting things. Mr. Forgetful went to do the rest of his shopping, but he couldn't remember what he was supposed to remember to shop for. Of course he couldn't, so Mr. Forgetful decided to go back home. On his way home, he met the village policeman going the other way. Good morning, Mr. Forgetful, said the policeman. Will you please give Farmer Fields a message for me, please? Farmer Fields had a farm not very far from Forget-Me-Not Cottage. Tell him that there's a sheep loose in the lane, said the policeman. Poor Mr. Forgetful. He had never had a message to remember before. There's a sheep loose in the lane, he said to himself as he hurried along. There's a sheep loose in the lane. A sheep loose in the lane. Mr. Forgetful repeated the message over and over and over again so that he would not forget. What's the message? A sheep loose in the lane. Finally he arrived at the farm and found Farmer Fields. Mr. Fields, he cried, there's a goose asleep in the rain. There's a goose asleep in the rain? Asked Farmer Fields. I don't have any geese, and it's not raining. Are you sure that's the message you had for me? Poor Mr. Forgetful. He'd gotten it all wrong again, and he couldn't remember how to get it all right. Mr. Forgetful walked away from Farmer Fields, feeling so sorry for himself that he didn't see that there was a sheep loose in the lane. He bumped right into it and fell over. Drat, said Mr. Forgetful. Bah, said the sheep. How silly. Letting a sheep loose in the lane, thought Mr. Forgetful. Then he remembered the message. He jumped back up and ran along the lane to the farm as fast as he could. Mr. Fields, he called. There's a goose asleep in the rain. Poor Mr. Forgetful. He'd forgotten again. Mr. Fields just scratched his head. Come with me, he said. Oh, excuse me. Come with me, cried Mr. Forgetful. He pulled Farmer Fields back along the lane until they came to the sheep that was loose. Then he stopped. Oh dear, he said. That's not a goose, that's a sheep. Mr. Forgetful blushed. He was turning red. He was embarrassed. Not a goose, it was a sheep. I think, said Farmer Fields, that you are the only goose. A silly goose. Farmer Fields laughed, and Mr. Forgetful giggled. Even the sheep started to laugh. Mr. Forgetful laughed so hard that he almost forgot that he couldn't remember things. Sometimes it is funny when you mess up. In the evening, Mr. Forgetful sat, relaxing in his favorite easy chair in Forget-Me-Not Cottage. He thought about the funny day he'd had. But do you know what? He tried and tried, but he couldn't remember anything that had happened all day. Poor Mr. Forgetful. The end. I hope you enjoyed the story today. Don't forget to watch tomorrow. See you later. Bye-bye.